What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. Halloween is right around the corner, and I thought it was an ideal time to create another top 10 list celebrating one of my all-time favorite filmmakers, David Cronenberg. While he's never worked exclusively within the horror genre, he's managed to write and direct some of the best horror films ever made over the course of his now 50-year career. What I love most about his career is how Cronenberg's movies are utterly unique in style and tone, exploding forth from his imagination without any obvious debt to any other filmmakers or filmmaking traditions. While he might admire filmmakers like Carol Reed, Ingmar Bergman, and Federico Fellini, he's never sought to model himself after their work. What I think can hold back the horror genre at times is how so many directors of horror struggle to escape the shadow of all the movies that they love. Admittedly, there are directors like Brian De Palma where his love of Hitchcock has helped inspire some of his best movies. But there are times where I grow frustrated that so few directors of horror bring any new ideas or stylistic sensibilities to the genre. David Cronenberg, on the other hand, has so successfully carved out his own niche that fans had to invent a new subgenre with which to categorize his films: body horror. Rather than confronting external threats like a giant monster or an axe-wielding maniac, oftentimes in the films of Cronenberg, the horrors come from within, almost as if we're witnessing firsthand the reshaping of the human body by modern technology. These changes might initially appear monstrous, but from Cronenberg's point of view, oftentimes these changes can be a fertilizing rather than a destructive event, as is so beautifully articulated in his 1996 film Crash, not to be confused with the sanctimonious film of the same name from 2004. Cronenberg has stated that many of his films can be best understood from the point of view of the disease, and that he identifies with his characters more once they begin to endure some agent of massive physical transformation. And while many filmmakers have taken a crack at stories where the protagonist is transformed against their will, it's Cronenberg's exquisite attention to detail as well as his scientific rigor which elevate his movies far above most genre films of a similar nature, giving them incredibly long shelf lives. What's interesting to me is how the horror of Cronenberg is not rooted in any spiritual tradition, as we see with classics like Rosemary's Baby or The Exorcist. Cronenberg is an outspoken atheist and is completely uninterested in ghosts and demons. Science is at the root of all Cronenberg's experiments with body horror, but perhaps the most important ingredient is his love of books. While Cronenberg did initially enter the honors science program at the University of Toronto in 1963, he eventually switched to honors English language. An avid reader and writer from an early age, Cronenberg very nearly had a different career as an author. By 1966, Cronenberg had fallen completely in love with the craft of filmmaking, but throughout his career, his ability to write original screenplays and successfully adapt other people's fiction has frequently distinguished him from other filmmakers of his generation. Because of his aptitude for the written word, in 1969, at the age of 26, Cronenberg managed to make what I think is his best early short film, Stereo, when he tricked the Canadian government into giving him a grant to write his first novel. Ironically, it would take until 2014 for Cronenberg to finally publish his first book, Consumed. My point is that Cronenberg brings to the table additional skills that a lot of movie-mad directors lack. I'm all for filmmakers like Scorsese and Tarantino, whose love of cinema inspires them to become filmmakers, but what I think gets overlooked sometimes is how advantageous it can be for a filmmaker when their sensibility is not informed exclusively by their love of film history. In terms of technique, Cronenberg is an incredibly flexible filmmaker, always eager to adapt to new ideas, and he doesn't try too hard to rigidly adhere to his original vision on a project once it's underway. He admits that he never prepares storyboards or shot lists, preferring instead to work intuitively once he's on the set. He enjoys experiencing how a movie gradually reveals itself to you over the course of a shoot, and how it can kind of push you around a bit with whatever unpredictable conditions you might encounter on location or with your collaborators. So when I decided to do this top 10, and I promise you my top 10 is coming, just for the time being, imagine like my head exploding or my chest opening up into a large vagina just to keep you entertained until I get to the official list, but all this information will be relevant. But when I started revisiting a lot of Cronenberg's movies, I ended up going down this very deep rabbit hole of every documentary and every podcast I could find where Cronenberg was being interviewed. And I have to admit that my research for this video was the most fun I've had preparing for any video on this channel. I honestly could listen to Cronenberg talk all day. He's so unpredictable and refreshingly original in his thinking. He's one of those rare people who, both in his films as well as in his interviews, is genuinely persuasive when it comes to tempting his audience to explore new terrain and ideas with which they might not be comfortable initially. What I found most surprising was how he pushed back on the official narrative of the evolution of his career. Like many, I've tended to look at the period from Shivers through The Fly as his classic horror period, with Dead Ringers in 1988 acting as the perfect pivot point into his more respectable prestige and art house period. But according to Cronenberg, he doesn't think about the arc of his career at all, Projects happen when he gets them financed, and if he'd had his way, Dead Ringers would have been made in 1981, which totally implodes the idea that in '88 he was ready for that big pivot. He says that thinking too much about how his work will be perceived by critics and fans could potentially give him creative paralysis. And in one interview I listened to, Cronenberg quoted author Vladimir Nabokov, who stated, "You have no social responsibility as an artist. You must not self-censor." And from Cronenberg's point of view, once the film's complete, it's up to the audience and the film historians to decide if his latest project is either a leap forward or retrograde or politically out of step with the times. But he says that thinking too much about any of those concerns in advance isn't helpful creatively. Above all else, art should first and foremost appeal to the subconscious. Now, creating a top 10 list is only exciting if it forces you to make some hard decisions. I think all of Cronenberg's movies are worth seeing, from his experimental underground shorts in the 60s up through the present day with the fantastic short he recently made for YouTube called The Nest. But before I sink my teeth into my official list, I have to give a few honorable mentions. The most controversial choice I've made is not to include The Naked Lunch in my top 10. This movie has many defenders and is a part of the Criterion Collection, but after seeing the movie at 18, reading the book in my 20s, and then seeing the film again a few days ago, I continue to find this movie almost completely impenetrable. But in terms of movies that I love that didn't make the cut, I need to give a shout out to Cronenberg's 1977 horror classic Rabid. I really like this flick, in particular its use of legendary porn star Marilyn Chambers as the star of the film, but so much of this movie for me feels almost inert in its pacing. That said, there's a lot to love about Rabid, in particular the devastatingly bleak final scene. My favorite honorable mention, which I saw for the first time in preparation for this video, is Cronenberg's 1969 black and white underground movie, Stereo. Any film that deals with telepathy and the Canadian Institute for Erotic Inquiry is naturally going to grab my attention, but the reason I'm calling attention to it is that so much of the DNA for Cronenberg's later movies, like Scanners, is already on display in this remarkable little movie. And one final thing before my official top 10, this video would be incomplete without calling attention to Howard Shore, Cronenberg's most frequent collaborator, and in my opinion, his best. The world might know and love Howard Shore because of the music he wrote for the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but it is impossible to imagine Cronenberg's best movies without the extraordinary scores composed by Shore. But enough procrastinating already, let's get down to it. I'll admit up front that I prefer Cronenberg's 20th century films over his 21st century output. In general, I tend to like the cinematography of Mark Irwin over Peter Shushitsky, but more often than not, it's the subject matter of Cronenberg's earlier movies that really grabs me. That said, two of his 21st century movies have made the list in the number 10 and number 9 slots. It was a photo finish between these two, but I have A History of Violence from 2005 at number 10. Based on a graphic novel, this movie was widely perceived by many, including myself, to be a bit of a commercial comeback for Cronenberg. His previous film, Spider, had really struggled to find an audience, but with this movie, we saw Aragorn himself, Viggo Mortensen, playing Tom, aka Joey, repeatedly eviscerating some very bad men throughout the film as Tom's violent past comes back to haunt him. What's fascinating about this movie is how the violence and savagery of Tom has consequences spilling over into this idyllic small-town environment and infecting his family members most of all. Ed Harris and Maria Bello are particularly good in this film, but I think my favorite ingredient is the scene at the end where Tom's little girl sets a place for him at the table after he returns from laying waste to his former associates. It's a rare, heartfelt happy ending in the world of Cronenberg. For number 9, I have Eastern Promises, a film which reunites David Cronenberg with Viggo Mortensen, written by Stephen Knight, who's gone on to earn massive acclaim in the world of television with shows like Peaky Blinders. This film offers a fascinating look inside the world of the Russian mafia operating in London. This movie is so hardcore, featuring so many mean old bastards, giving us great scenes like Viggo Mortensen putting out a cigarette on his tongue before getting back to work, removing the teeth and fingers from a frozen dead corpse. Cronenberg's days of body horror are far behind him at this point, but that in no way prevents him from showing us a variety of savage scenes, including an incredibly realistic throat-cutting sequence of a teenage boy in a cemetery. But the real showstopper of this movie is the scene where both Cronenberg and Mortensen agreed it would be shot in the nude when Viggo's character has to fight two dudes to the death in a Russian bathhouse. It quite literally and figuratively is one of the ballsiest fight scenes ever filmed. Sadly, the planned sequel never materialized, but the movie's absolutely worth hunting down. Now it's time to wind the clock back to the early days. For my number 8, I have Cronenberg's 1975 debut feature film, Shivers, also known as They Came From Within, which was originally conceived as Orgy of the Blood Parasites. Cronenberg's earlier films, Stereo and Crimes of the Future, were slightly over an hour in length, but this film is generally regarded as the beginning of his professional career, getting paid to write and direct movies. Shot in only 15 days, this movie still packs a major punch, and whenever I rewatch it, within seconds I fall in love with it all over again. This movie essentially explores what would happen if organ transplants and a venereal disease merged into aggressive parasites whose sole goal is to turn the world into just a massive destructive orgy. This is a movie where nearly every character has sex on the brain even before they're infected, giving the parasite a serious head start before anything can be done about it. Barbara Steele and Lynn Lowry are smoking hot in their roles. I particularly like the scene where Lowry's character, after she's been infected, describes a dream about making love to a strange old man that seems to sum up so many aspects of Cronenberg's career.
He's old and dying, and he smells bad, and I find him repulsive. But then he tells me that everything is erotic, that everything is sexual. You know what I mean? He tells me that even old flesh is erotic flesh, that disease is the love of two alien kinds of creatures for each other, that even dying is an act of eroticism.
I have nothing to add that can top that. Number 7. Time to sink our teeth into one of Cronenberg's biggest early commercial successes from 1981, Scanners, a film that features one of the most notorious moments from Cronenberg's entire career, where we see just how terrifying an assassin would be when armed only with the power of telepathy. The shot in question involved a lot of dog food, leftover lunch, rabbit livers, and a 12-gauge shotgun, but as astonishing as Dick Smith's special effects might be for this movie, what really grabs me is the tale of Cameron Vale and Daryl Revick, two of the most hardcore telepaths that we'll ever see on the screen. As someone who grew up reading a lot of X-Men comics, I've always been a fan of telepathy and psychic combat, but the X-Men comics and movies would never dare enter the terrain that this film is willing to explore. My only real knock against this movie is the performance of the lead, Stephen Lack, who I find pretty limp. But the flip side is Michael Ironside, who plays one of the coolest villains from any science fiction or horror movie I've ever seen. Even his name, Revick, is totally badass. What's interesting for Cronenberg fanatics is seeing just how many ingredients from this film are already at play in Cronenberg's 1969 experimental film, Stereo, including the idea of relieving telepathic pressure by drilling a hole right into the middle of your forehead. But this movie is well known as one of the most frustrating and difficult productions of Cronenberg's career, but luckily for us, the final results have aged very well and continue to live up to the film's legendary status. Number 6. The Dead Zone. Cronenberg has more than his fair share of incredible original screenplays to his name, but I'm always interested in his adaptations of other people's work as well. The Dead Zone is one of my all-time favorite adaptations of any of Stephen King's books, alongside Stand By Me, Carrie, The Shining, and The Shawshank Redemption. But even more interesting are some of Cronenberg's comments regarding how to adapt a book successfully. This might sound counterintuitive, but he believes that in order to be faithful to a novel, you have to reinvent the thing completely. And usually after his first draft, he puts away the book in question for good. That might sound like heresy, but Cronenberg is all too aware that movies and fiction are two very different mediums that communicate information in totally different ways. An internal monologue works just fine on the page, but in a movie, it runs the risk of coming across as clumsy or ridiculous. That said, Cronenberg says adapting books is as satisfying for him as writing an original screenplay, and I think the final result here is one of his strongest efforts. Christopher Walken just nails it with his involuntary flinches during his visions, or the way he screams, "The ice is gonna break!"
Now, don't give me any argument. The ice is gonna break!
And for those of you out there who like their Cronenberg films to go to the dark side, this movie features one of the nastiest suicides ever caught on film. I promise you'll never look at a pair of scissors the same way ever again. So I've been talking a while at this point. I think it's time to liven things up with a little SEX. And this next choice might be a little controversial, but I think this is Cronenberg's best film from the 1990s. His 1996 adaptation of J.G. Ballard's Crash. Ranked by Martin Scorsese as his number 8 in his favorite movies of the 1990s, I have to admit, I didn't think much of Crash when I first saw it at age 21, when the movie was first released, but the movie's really grown on me over the years. I don't know what that says about me, because this movie is arguably Cronenberg's most provocative meditation on sexuality, in particular, how the damage sustained in car wrecks can be a transformative event through which certain individuals achieve sexual ecstasy. For those who don't know, Cronenberg's a massive car nut and is incredibly passionate about Formula One. That said, his earlier car movie, Fast Company, rarely gets picked by anyone as anyone's favorite Cronenberg movie, even if I'll admit that I do like seeing the great Claudia Jennings in action. But with that in mind, Crash is the one movie where Cronenberg's preoccupation with body horror and cars come crashing together, making it feel like one of his most personal films, even if it is a literary adaptation. While the film is much more grounded in reality than his earlier films, seeing the pins in James Spader's leg after a horrible car accident is just as disturbing and disgusting as anything from his films like The Brood or Videodrome. The reshaping of the human body through technology is obviously a recurring theme for Cronenberg, but in this movie, we're taken to the very edge of this obsession, in particular with Rosanna Arquette's character, who's basically encased in body armor just to give her some limited mobility, and yet she continues to explore this fixation, joining in on a three-way handjob session as she, Holly Hunter, and James Spader watch videos of crash tests, or in another scene where Spader hungrily licks the surgical scars on the back of her thigh when they finally get a chance to get it on properly. Crash frequently and fearlessly cuts straight from one dangerous erotic encounter right into the next, featuring characters covered in bruises or who might have horrible scar tissue on their genitalia. This flick absolutely wallows in some legit fringe sexuality, but I'd be lying if I didn't admit that I find this movie to be a huge turn-on. Deborah Kara Unger, Holly Hunter, and Rosanna Arquette, they just hurl themselves into their roles, and my only real knock against this movie is that it doesn't have much of an ending and just kind of stops. With a better conclusion, it might have taken the #1 slot, but in spite of that one gripe on my part, I find this movie to be an essential viewing experience. So for my number 4, it's time to talk about the very first David Cronenberg movie that I ever saw. I had no idea who Cronenberg was at the time, but this movie was not only a monster hit, no pun intended, but it absolutely wrecked me at the tender, impressionable age of 10, The Fly. Having just revisited the film for the first time in years, I was blown away by how effective it continues to be. Also, quick side note, this is one of Cronenberg's many movies that has between a 90 and 100-minute running time. I can't emphasize enough just how tightly and effectively Cronenberg is able to construct his tales. But this movie was my introduction to Jeff Goldblum and Gina Davis, who were romantically involved at the time, which plays a huge role in this being the best love story of Cronenberg's career, admittedly a tragic love story. And because this movie takes its time developing this relationship before the horrors begin to unfold, the inevitable transformation of Seth Brundle is all the more impactful once it begins to take place. When warning his lover of the growing danger of being near him, he tells her, "I'm saying I'm an insect who dreamt he was a man, but now the insect is awake." These are not empty words. When Seth finally cuts loose, it's some of the most savage, horrific carnage ever put on the screen by Cronenberg or any filmmaker. And speaking of Cronenberg, it must be said, he makes one of his best cameos in this movie in the notorious dream sequence where Gina Davis gives birth to this disgusting, squirming larva. Her classic line, "Be afraid, be very afraid," is 100% justified and ended up on the posters for the movie. In the end, what separates this movie from the pack of other routine mad scientist movies is the idea that Brundle is stricken with a disease with a purpose, a disease that wants to turn him into something else, an angle that Cronenberg has often stated as a metaphor for the aging process and how dehumanizing a disease can be, both to the afflicted person as well as the people around them. My understanding is that the most horrific scene of the movie, involving gene splicing a cat with a monkey, was cut after a disastrous preview screening. Unlike most directors who hate preview screenings because they can lead to studios panicking when an audience freaks out, Cronenberg actually embraces the preview process and the fresh perspective that it offers, frequently making changes to his movies based upon how audiences are responding. Personally, I'd love to see some of these outtakes from his movies, but the success of his films is proof that previews don't automatically invite disaster for a movie while still being cut together. In any case, now we're really getting into the juiciest movies of Cronenberg's career, and I could have just as easily rearranged my top 3 and been equally satisfied with the result, but for number 3, I'm going with The Brood. Released in 1979, The Brood is one of Cronenberg's most personal movies in that it directly tackles the emotions he experienced while going through a really nasty divorce and child custody battle. I can only imagine what his ex must have felt like when she eventually saw Samantha Eggar's performance as Nola in this remarkable movie. But for me, chronologically, this is the first movie by David Cronenberg that I describe as a masterpiece of horror. If you haven't seen it, skip the next minute or two because I'm going to spoil the shit out of it. But like with the best of Cronenberg's movies, he takes a little bit of hard science and then injects it with Cronenbergian steroids, giving us the exquisite horror of psychoplasmics invented by Alvarez's character, Dr. Raglan, a technique through which his patients process their rage, come out the other end, only to confront devastating physical side effects. Some patients develop lymphosarcoma, where the body outright turns against them, or in the case of Nola, she quite literally gives birth to a savage brood of monstrosities that attack and kill anyone that incurs Nola's wrath. Quick side note, Samantha Eggar grew up on a farm, and it was her idea to clean her newborn brood babies with her mouth after watching dogs do the same thing to their pups. But as deliciously gross as this movie can be, the horror also manages to really get under your skin, especially the idea that abuses suffered as children get internalized and then express themselves in horrifying ways on the next generation, perpetuating a cycle of abuse. And while Cronenberg's career is littered with classic eerie shots, the eeriest of his entire career just might be the shot of Candace walking down a snowy road hand in hand with two monstrosities guiding her back to the barn where they live. For fans of undiluted Cronenberg, this is what his movies are all about. Number 2. At last we come to the Cronenberg movie that I've probably seen more than any of his other movies, a film that for many cinephiles is a genuinely life-altering experience the first time they see it. From 1983, Videodrome. Videodrome is one of the most eerily prescient movies ever made about a relationship with the media we consume and the technology with which we consume it. A relationship that is increasingly overtly sexual and symbiotic. I've heard of human beings being described as the sex organs for technology, but Videodrome takes this relationship way further, where technology itself becomes physically aroused by human contact, writhing and pulsing in ecstasy as it's touched by human fingers. And taking things a few steps further into the deranged, technology quite literally sexually penetrates human beings in this movie instead of the reverse. For this visionary masterwork of perversion, James Woods was perfectly cast as Max Wren, a sketchy cable TV programmer whose hunt for intoxicating sexual and violent content leads him down the road to a hallucinatory revolution that eventually gives birth to the new flesh. To this day, you can instantly make all kinds of new interesting friends just by going on social media and writing, "Death to Videodrome, long live the new flesh." Try it and see what happens. The New Flesh could basically serve as an alternate title for all of Cronenberg's best movies, but now's probably as good a time as any to tackle Cronenberg's ideas about home video, both in this film as well as how it applies to his career, because he realized early on that most of his audience was going to experience his movies either by renting a VHS cassette or catching the flicks on cable. He totally embraced this and shot his films accordingly, knowing full well how movie freaks would soon value their movie collections at home the same way an avid reader values their bookshelf. In interviews as far back as 1990, Cronenberg talks about how watching video with headphones can be incredibly intense, a fact that anyone today with an iPad can attest to. As a technological medium, cinema is always in a state of perpetual change, and Cronenberg has always embraced these changes every step of the way, an attitude I wholeheartedly agree with. But getting back to Videodrome, on a personal level, this movie was a real eye-opener, and this is probably much more information than you want to know about me, but this movie was also a game changer for me sexually. During one of our evenings with Max, Deborah Harry's character Nikki Brand catches Max off guard with some of the things that she's into, whereupon she purrs the line, "You want to try a few things?" The line is so simple, but from the way she says it, you can tell she's not suggesting that they try something as vanilla as switching who might be on top. She's inviting him to explore a new frontier that even a sleazy guy like Max might be a little afraid of. Now, I'm not saying that after seeing this movie, I immediately jumped feet first into cutting myself or burning myself during the physical act of love, but prior to seeing that scene, it had never really occurred to me that sex was an experience where one could be as open and curious as a cinephile might be when it comes to seeking out obscure, outrageous movies. And as wild as this movie might be, due to budget and scheduling problems, Cronenberg sadly never got to shoot his epilogue for the movie. Apparently, the original ending featured Max, Nikki, and Bianca Oblivion all making an appearance on the new show Videodrome, where new sexual organs would emerge from the vaginal slits that they all have down their chests. Who knows? Just seeing that might have made people's heads explode like that scene in Scanners, but luckily for us, Videodrome remains potent as hell, and I think will continue to fascinate people for many more years to come. And if you're a hardcore Cronenberg fan, you know what's coming as my number one, Dead Ringer, starring Jeremy Irons as twin gynecologists Elliot and Beverly Mantle. I'll never forget my first experience watching this movie back in college when a friend of mine and I, we just tossed in the DVD not really knowing what to expect. And within minutes, my friend looked over at me, totally disturbed, and was like, "Jamie, what's happening?" And to put it mildly, we were enthralled by the movie, which left us laughing hysterically, shrieking in horror, or sometimes both at the same time. In my opinion, this is Cronenberg's most masterfully constructed story that he's ever come up with, one that tackles drug addiction, gynecology, physical mutations, sex addiction, and of course, what it's like to be a twin, with some of the most interesting and perverse sibling power dynamics that I've ever seen. I've watched this movie many times, and yet Jeremy Irons' two performances are so dynamic and so compelling that each time I watch it, he makes me forget that I'm not watching a movie starring two different people. Some of this illusion is simple technique, like standing on his heels as the confident Elliot or putting his weight on his toes as the more introverted Beverly, but this performance goes so much deeper than simple craft as we follow Beverly's harrowing descent into becoming a paranoid, drug-addled mad scientist designing new technology to operate on mutant women. These days, a lot of people casually toss around the terms art house horror or elevated horror, but this is truly one of those films where the sublime and the profane collide in a work of devastating power, resulting in one of my all-time favorite films. So we've reached the end of my rant, and I'm starting to lose my voice. I could talk indefinitely about Cronenberg's movies, and there's so much more to explore. As great as he is as a filmmaker, I also really enjoy seeing his amazing cameos, both in his films as well as others. I had no idea that he was the man who directed The Fly when I saw him wreaking havoc in Clive Barker's Nightbreed, but he was one of the best parts of that movie in my opinion. Martin Scorsese, who's a massive fan of Cronenberg's work, was caught off guard when he finally met David Cronenberg, saying that he looked like a Beverly Hills plastic surgeon, which may or may not have played a role in Cronenberg casting himself as the doctor in The Fly. But I always love it when he pulls a Hitchcock and sneaks himself into his movies. But I think I've gotten most of what I wanted to say off my chest. Cronenberg is one of those directors whose reputation is always on the rise with me. Experiencing his movies in my teens and my 20s was a completely different experience for me than watching his movies now, and if possible, I like his movies now more than ever. He's easily one of my favorite filmmakers who's been active during my lifetime, and I hope this video will encourage some more people out there to discover his work. I had a blast putting this list together, and if you enjoyed it, I'm definitely planning on cooking up more top 10 videos in the future. But for now, I'm going to sign off. If you want to talk more about David Cronenberg, hunt me down on Twitter at Colbrax, or you can leave me a comment in the comments below. But can't thank you enough for watching this lengthy rant, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.